the 7th of June 2015, paramedic Carl W. Fisher attended a case involving a mother who fainted whilst holding her baby. Mr. Fisher, employed as a paramedic with the East Midlands Ambulance Service for more than 20 years, responded to the incident in a solo, fast response vehicle. The mother's concerns about the baby being dropped were completely disregarded and both patients were discharged on scene. 1 week later, the baby was diagnosed with a fractured skull and Mr. Fisher was found to have completed the mother's paperwork with a variety of deficits. On the 24th of June 2015, a paramedic clinical assessment on Mr. Fisher was conducted, which the registrant did not complete to an adequate standard. These issues constituted misconduct and negligence, questioning Mr. Fisher's fitness to practice. The key legal concept that applies to this case is the tort of negligence and its element of duty of care. Negligence involves the failure of a health practitioner to take reasonable care to avoid harm or loss when treating a patient. In this case, it is believed that gross negligence occurred as Mr. Fisher consciously and voluntarily disregarded the need to use reasonable care in the assessment of the patients. Because he breached the standard of care reasonably expected of registered paramedics, his actions also constitute professional misconduct. Professional misconduct is defined as conduct that causes a serious or imminent risk to the health and safety of a person or reputation, viability and profitability of a business. Through applying the tort of negligence and using the legislation enforced by the Queensland Government as well as AHPRA, Paramedics Australasia, Fair Work Australia and the Civil Liability Act of 2003, an outcome regarding Mr. Fisher's fitness to practice can be determined. To prove negligence, a duty of care must be owed and that duty of care must be breached and have caused damages. As a paramedic in Queensland, your code of conduct is monitored by the Paramedic Board of Australia led by AHPRA. AHPRA also operates in conjunction with Paramedics Australasia and Queensland Health. Therefore, to determine if Fisher was negligent, his duty of care owed to his patients must first be established. The Queensland Ambulance Service Clinical Practice Guidelines are in place to guide paramedics' clinical decision making. The Paediatric Clinical Assessment Tool is available to all QAS officers and is required to be used in all paediatric cases, irrespective of the situation. Therefore, Fisher ignored the indication from the guideline to take a detailed assessment of the child. The primary and secondary survey is another key assessment tool that must be provided to patients in all situations. Fisher again failed to complete a comprehensive clinical assessment despite being indicated to do so. As a result, he breached the standard of care expected by Queensland paramedics. The Australian Board of Paramedicine aims to support practitioners to deliver appropriate and effective services within an ethical framework. The Code of Conduct states the way Queensland paramedics are to provide good care. When comparing these standards to Mr. Fisher's clinical practice, it is evidence that he breached the standards set in place by AHPRA. As AHPRA acts in conjunction with Queensland Health and Paramedics Australasia, Fisher's actions must also be compared to their standard of care. Queensland Health has a national code of conduct for healthcare workers which can be applied to Queensland paramedics. The code of conduct is divided into separate sections with each addressing expectations of Queensland healthcare workers. Mr. Fisher breached Section 1 as he discharged both patients without transport to a medical facility for further examination and treatment. He also breached Section 15 by failing to complete the appropriate documentation. Paramedics Australasia assists in legislation and clinical practice development, playing a huge role in the competence standards enforced by AHPRA. Competency is defined as the combination of knowledge, skills and attitudes necessary for a paramedic to practice at an acceptable standard. Therefore, competency standards ensure that paramedic practice is current and consistent and that the care provided is at a high level. As Mr. Fisher failed to undertake a comprehensive assessment and focused clinical examination of both patients, he failed to meet Paramedics Australasia's expectations. Causation is another key element of negligence to be considered and occurs when a breach in duty of care causes direct harm. While Fisher did not cause direct physical harm, his knowledge and clinical skill set should have enabled him to foresee the patient's need for further medical attention. Thus, this negligence makes him responsible for the damage and risk he imposed on his patients by failing to transport them. Another concept to be considered is whether other professionals placed in the same situation would have acted in the same way as Fisher. Per the Civil Liability Act, a professional does not breach their duty of care if their clinical decisions are widely accepted by peer professional opinion. In this case, the QAS guidelines are considered the foundation of competent paramedic practice. Therefore, by not following these guidelines, Fisher's actions would not be widely accepted by other professionals in the field. In this situation, Fisher failed to act by not following the QAS guidelines and by incorrectly documenting the case. This omission and the likelihood of Fisher's actions not being widely accepted by peer professionals indicate negligence. Furthermore, Fisher did not take reasonable precautions against a risk of harm. Documentation is an essential part of paramedic practice. By not completing this, Fisher failed to meet the standards set in place by AHPRA. Per the National Code of Conduct for Healthcare Workers, a healthcare worker should recommend and assist the patient in finding additional services when required. By failing to do this, Fisher was practicing in an unethical and unsafe manner. Similarly, Section 3C Ambulance Act 1991 states that it is a paramedic's duty to protect persons from injury and provide transport to medical facilities for those in need. Fisher neglected this duty by not addressing the patient's potential injuries and failing to provide transport. In addition, per Section 18A, a paramedic has grounds for discipline if they perform their duties incompletely or are guilty of misconduct. This is in accordance with Section 55 of the Health Practitioner Regulation National Law, which states the national body may decide an individual is not suitable to hold general registration in a health profession if they fail to meet the competence and safety standards required. Applying Queensland law to the case, it is concluded that Fisher is unable to practice in the safe, ethical and competent manner required of AHPRA, Queensland Health and Paramedics Australasia, and is therefore unfit to practice. This is in accordance with Section 18A of the Ambulance Act and Section 55 of the Health Practitioner Regulation National Law. Due to his lack of remorse, disinterest in improvement and failure to attend his hearings, it is unlikely that Fisher can be retrained to the standards required of QAS paramedics. The case of Matteo v. Higgins and Fraser, 2008, presents a similar situation where a paramedic was given 12 months to improve on his practice standards, however, failed to do so and required to meet the standards for a second time. A paramedic is a registered health professional who provides out-of-hospital care. They are often responsible for servicing very vulnerable members of the public, and as such, their clinical practice is required to meet the highest standards set by AHPRA, Queensland Health and Paramedics Australasia. To not complete patient assessments, offer appropriate treatment, or complete the necessary patient documentation makes Fisher a complete liability. Negligent care would mean that a patient deteriorates to a point beyond treatment, and therefore, revoking Fisher's registration supports patient safety by preventing him from imposing unnecessary and potentially life-threatening risks on future patients.